Hello, bearded bee people. Getting into bees can be overwhelming. Obviously, there's tons of different equipment choices, but there's also the choice of where do you get bees? Should you get packages or nukes, or should you try to catch a wild swarm? That's what we're going to talk about today on B&K Bees. The direction that this conversation goes in most online beekeeping forums is the advantage of local bees as opposed to imported bees. If you live in Georgia or Texas or California, this might not be so much of a problem because you can get local nukes and packages that are from some local bee providers. But if you live in Michigan, like I do, or almost any other portion of the country, you'll have the option of getting nucleus colonies from local providers that have their bees go through the same weathering conditions that yours will. But you can also purchase imported packages, which are generally cheaper, but as I said, they're imported and so therefore not quite as familiar with your area. Is this a must-have situation in terms of locally adapted bees? No. No, it's not. I think that it's actually sort of overblown. Healthy bees survive. There are some areas where locally adapted bees are far better than the southern bees, here in Michigan anyway, and that would be generally how they get started in the spring. Georgia, California, southern bees, they'll get started in the spring a lot quicker. They will lay eggs and get started on a brood nest almost immediately when the days start to get longer and the temperatures start to rise. This would, like on paper or just passively thinking about it, seem like a good thing. That's great. Let's get more bees. Let's start the bee year earlier so that we can get things rolling and create honey or queens or whatever it is we want to do. The problem with that is in May, late April, in Michigan, we always have some weather anomalies. So these colonies will go to their fullest efforts to create a brood nest on the last legs of their food, counting on the fact that the temperature is going to continually steadily rise, when in reality, in most cases, we will have at least a couple of dips back into winter conditions before spring fully hits. Now, this usually isn't too much of a problem unless these colonies are on their absolute last legs, but it can be an issue. And watching these locally adapted bees take their time and be much more efficient with their food usage definitely leads me to say that there is some advantage in locally adapted bees. But once again, my main point here is that that does not mean packages from Georgia won't survive in Michigan. I've seen hundreds of them survive and survive really, really well. So that should not make the decision for you completely, but it should be weighed in while you're trying to figure out where you're going to get bees. In addition to considering the source and the location of these bees, you should also try to consider the cost. And I'm sure you are. It's not something that you have to have me tell you to do. It's a big thing, purchasing colonies and all the equipment that is required to take care of these colonies. So I'm sure you're being very, very aware of the finances of it. But just to put it clearly, nukes are more expensive. Nukes are a couple steps ahead in terms of the race of the bee year. They have an established brood nest. They've got food inside the hive already. They've got some wax that's drawn out. Those are advantages for sure. The disadvantage is the fact that they could be twice as expensive as a package, especially if you're buying a bunch of packages. So figure out how many colonies you want, how much money you can possibly spend on them, and try to see what kind of scenario you can make happen. If you can definitely afford the amount of nukes that you really, really want to fill out your apiary, then I think that's great. You're going to make a good friend in that local nuke provider, somebody that you can lean on for questions and advice. And you'll have these colonies that are locally adapted and already established, and you won't have to go through the sort of tricky early season period of installing and caring for a package while they get established. What shouldn't be overlooked here are the freebie availabilities. And I'm not talking about swarms. We will talk about swarms in a little bit. But I'm talking about local beekeepers who may be eager to give you a split. Don't go around asking people for a split. But in a lot of cases, in local bee clubs, there are people who just can't figure out what to do with all the bees. When they've got a really good year, they went in with 8, they can only handle 8, and they had 7 or 8 come through the winter. Generally, those people are going to be looking to get rid of some bees. Now, a lot of them will sell them, and I think that that's the best way to do it. You might as well make some money from these bees if you're going to get rid of them. But a lot of them just aren't in it for money and will just help out a new beekeeper by giving them a few frames. That's a great way. If you can figure that out, if you can find somebody like that, those will also probably be a good mentor, and there's nothing better than free bees, so take advantage of that. But once again, don't go around asking people for free bees. I don't think that's a great way to get started. So, for packages, pros and cons. The pros are they're cheap. They're the cheapest, most cost-efficient way of getting a bunch of bees. That is pretty much the extent of the pros. The cons are that you have to install them. I'll put a clip of me shaking some bees here. You have to install them. You've got to care for the queen while she's being released. These bees and the queens have sort of an undetermined amount of time together, so you can't really just release the queen right away without any fear of those bees retaliating. So she has to be slowly released from this cage, and this cage has to be suspended in the center of the action in the brood or in the hive cavity that you're installing them. And then you've got to take care of all these frames and trying to make sure that they're drawing the wax out in a proper form and making certain that they've got enough food to draw out the wax, but not too much to clog up the combs that they're creating. So it's a delicate balance at the beginning of the year when you're starting off with packages, and I think that that's a legitimate con. Nukes, pros and cons. The pros, there are quite a few. They're locally adapted. Obviously, you can get imported nukes, but I wouldn't suggest that. If you're going to pay top dollar for a nucleus colony, you should find the most local one to you. And you'll probably be surprised at just how local that is. So find your local beekeeping club or a local online beekeeping forum and ask around, and I promise you'll be able to find somebody surprisingly local. Another advantage is the fact that they are a couple steps ahead. They've got a few frames of brood, they've got some food already established in the hive, they've got different generations of bees inside the hive, which is advantageous to have foraging happening and nurse bee happening at the same time, because when you're dealing with packages, in a lot of cases, there's just a lot of young bees in there that aren't so good at foraging, or older bees that aren't so good at nurse bee activity. So having all of these different generations in the colony at once is a great advantage. Another advantage to nukes is the fact that installing them is just as easy as taking frames out of one box and putting them into another. There's really no extra trick to it the way there are in installing packages. You see, when a package is installed, you have to shake them from that box and hope that they all just decide that this is a suitable location to stay, and hope that they've made enough of an acquaintance with the queen inside that cage so that when she does get released, she's not immediately balled and killed. Now, that might have made it sound a little bit harder than it is. It definitely made it sound a little bit harder than it is, but installing nukes just honestly couldn't be easier. Okay, so the last method of acquiring bees that I can think of is catching a wild swarm. If you are dead set on having bees next year, I don't recommend this as your only source of acquiring those bees. If you ordered a couple of packages and also want to try to set up some swarm traps, I think that's great. Or if you already have a few hives and would like to see if you could find some freebies, definitely do that. You may and you may not find them, which is why I don't recommend it if you're dead set on having bees. Now, the pros in this case are obvious. They're free. They are, if you're catching them in the swarm portion of the year, they're the best kind of swarm. They're a reproductive swarm that are full of wax-age bees that are ready to draw out comb and build up a nest as quickly as you've ever seen a group of bees build up a nest. So these are great bees to have. They're just hit and miss as to whether you're going to be able to find them. A couple of tips are, usually you'll want to have a larger cavity than you think. Putting out a nuke is just too small of a cavity for a nuke, or putting out a nuke box is too small of a cavity for a swarm to consider it a suitable hive. Even though they might comfortably fit inside that box, they have every intention of growing, and therefore they usually choose something around the size of a 10 frame deep, but you can even go a little bit bigger than that. Another tip would be to try to find an area that catches swarms every year, because usually there will be a commercial yard somewhere or just some apiary in the vicinity that sends out swarms to this specific spot every year. If you can find that, you have a very high likelihood of catching some bees. And lastly, in terms of advice for catching swarms, would be old comb is the best bait that you can find. There are a lot of swarm baits that you can purchase, and those are essentially lemongrass oil. So lemongrass oil is another alternative bait, but I've found the best bait to be the oldest, most crusty brown combs that you can find. Now that doesn't mean setting them up in the box so that they can build their nest on that. You can just include a little piece of the comb laying on the bottom of the box. Just that scent that will bring those scout bees to the area that will then get them to assess whether it's a suitable spot. It's just great. That's the cheapest and most effective swarm bait that you can acquire. Okay, so I think that's it. Obviously, there's probably a lot of room for questions. If you have questions, leave them in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to chat with you about it. But generally, I highly recommend Nukes. If you can afford them, get Nukes. You'll make an awesome friend in that local nuke provider. You'll have a mentor. You'll have some locally adapted bees, and you'll sidestep a lot of those issues that new beekeepers have in installing their packages at the beginning of the year. If you can't afford them, go with packages. That's a great way to have bees. Healthy bees survive, so just keep them healthy and you'll do fine. At some point in the future, you can try to requeen them with a locally adapted queen, and that'll sort of get you those locally adapted genetics. That's tough to implement during that first year, and I don't even recommend it. If you get packages and you are a beginning beekeeper, just make sure that they're well fed and mite and virus free at the end of the year, and I think you'll see some success. So, thank you very much for watching. We have some cool science content over on our other channel called BK Curiosity. There's a link to that in the description below. We also have a Patreon. If you're super inclined and you want to help us financially to be able to continue creating these videos going forward, you can go to patreon.com/bkbees. I'd appreciate the heck out of that. But honestly though, I just appreciate you being here and you watching. So thank you. Get out there and have some fun with your bees. See ya.